Mysterious Ancient Mariners.
Part 16. The Multifaceted Maritime Jewel of Ancient Rome.
As Portus grew, so too did its neighbor, Ostia. Though it had once been Rome's principal harbor, it evolved into a vital administrative and residential center, housing the workers and officials who kept the ports running. A city of brick and stone, it was lined with sturdy apartment buildings, some rising 5 stories high. Granaries, temples, and wine shops filled its streets, while taverns served the ever-present crowds of sailors, merchants, and laborers. Ostia was a microcosm of Rome itself, an urban center with its own upper class of wealthy merchants and financiers, a large middle class of port administrators and skilled tradesmen, and an underclass of slaves who labored in the docks and warehouses. It was no mere outpost of the capital, but a city in its own right, complete with a suburb of luxurious coastal villas where the wealthy retreated from the din of commerce. From these ports the empire was sustained. From these harbors the ships of Rome ventured forth, ensuring that the heart of civilization never faltered. As long as these waters were busy, as long as the cranes lifted their cargo and the quays echoed with the voices of 1,000 merchants, the empire lived. Beneath the grandeur of Rome's marble temples and sprawling forums, beyond the might of its legions and its discipline of its governors, it was trade, vast, intricate, and ceaseless, that kept the empire alive. The wharves of Ostia and Portus, bustling with laborers, merchants, and sailors, were the true arteries of Rome's wealth, linking the capital to the farthest reaches of the known world. The thriving ports of Ostia and Portus were not merely collections of ships and warehouses. They were home to an elaborate network of collegia, guilds that bound the dockside world together. These organizations were more than trade unions. They were fraternal societies, bringing together merchants, craftsmen, shipbuilders, and laborers under a shared identity. Membership extended to both workers and employers, ensuring that these guilds wielded influence beyond their individual trades. Some guilds, like those for shipbuilders, held a certain prestige, and records show that even a woman could be counted among their ranks in the late 2nd century AD, a rare distinction in the male-dominated world of Roman commerce. Others catered to a more humble but essential roles: warehousemen, stevedores, divers who retrieved lost cargo, and even arena workers known as sandmen, who provided ballast for ships. Each guild, from the elite traders in wine and oil to the laborers hauling amphorae on the docks, was a cog in the great machine of Roman commerce. For 2 years under this Pax Romana, the long peace inaugurated by Augustus, these guilds and their trades flourished. Roman merchants, emboldened by the security of the imperial navy, reached even farther, their ships venturing to Ireland and the Baltic Sea, along the Red Sea coast of Ethiopia and deep into the Indian Ocean. Goods from every corner of the empire and beyond flowed toward Rome, carried by the sturdy merchantmen whose square sails caught the Mediterranean breeze. The prosperity of Rome's traders was immense, but it did come at a cost. A single storm, an unlucky shipwreck, or a loss of cargo to bandits could spell financial ruin. Nowhere is this precarious balance more vividly captured than in the satirical pages of Petronius, who, during Nero's reign, immortalized the figure of Trimalchio, an ex-slave turned multi-millionaire merchant. Trimalchio, ever boastful, regaled his dinner guest with the stories of his reckless ventures. "I built myself 5 ships, loaded them with wine, worth its weight in gold at the time, and sent them to Rome. Every single one of them was wrecked. That's the God's honest truth. Neptune gulped down a cool 30 million in one day. I built myself some more, got hold of another cargo of wine, added bacon, beans, and loads of slaves. The little woman sold all her jewels to raise the cash. I netted a cool 10 million on that one voyage." For Trimalchio, the risk was part of the game, and he had the fortune to rebuild after disaster struck. But not all merchants were so lucky. Many who lost their fortunes found themselves in debtor's prison, trapped behind bars until they could scrounge together enough to buy their freedom. One such unfortunate trader, condemned to a cell, received an unlikely stroke of luck. A condemned murderer, awaiting execution, revealed to him the location of a hidden treasure. The merchant's wife unearthed the buried treasure, paid off his debts, and set him free to trade again. For those willing to brave the uncertainty, however, the rewards were unparalleled. The empire was a vast and hungry marketplace, demanding everything from the commonplace to the exotic. Rome's appetite for goods was insatiable. From every province, from every coastline, from lands beyond the empire's reach, the merchants of Rome gathered a staggering variety of commodities. From Britain, they gathered cattle, slaves, geese, and fierce hunting dogs. From Germany, amber, harvested from the Baltic shores, as valuable as gold. From Gaul, cereals, wine, wool, flax, vegetables, pickled pork, fish, and pottery. Gaul's exports flooded the Mediterranean, so much so that King Herod Agrippa of Judea remarked that Gauls had flooded the whole world with their goods. Spain, rich in minerals, its mines of gold, silver, lead, and iron were among the most productive in the empire. Its agriculture thrived as well, exporting olive oil, wool, flax, and grasses for rope making. Beyond Greece's cultural influence, Greece was also a hub of high-quality exports. Luminescent white marble from Athens, veined and greenish stones from the Peloponnesus, honey from Mount Hymettus, and horses from the plains of Thessaly. Copper and smelted bronze from Cyprus fueled Rome's metalworking industry. Asia Minor, now Turkey, was a land of hidden treasures. Medicinal herbs, saffron, wild spikenard, goat hair cloaks, beeswax, and the famous wool of Miletus, the finest in the empire. The forests of the Black Sea provided timber for Rome's ever-growing navy. From Carthage in North Africa, rebuilt by Julius Caesar after its legendary destruction, had risen again as a major commercial power. It supplied vast quantities of grain and olive oil. From farther south came ivory, ostrich feathers, and even rhinoceros horn, prized for its supposed medicinal properties, as well as its supposed libido-boosting properties. But among all these imports, the most significant and the most tragic was the human chattel, the slave trade. Though no longer as vast as during Rome's great conquests, remained an integral part of the economy. Pliny the Younger, a man of letters and refinement, owned at least 500 slaves, freeing 100 of them in his will, which was the maximum allowed by law. Slaves were so numerous that when some senators proposed they wear identifying clothing, the idea was abandoned out of fear that they would recognize their own numbers and their own potential strength. Rome was not merely an empire of conquest, it was an empire of exchange. The goods that filled its ports and markets connected it to distant lands, linking Britain's windswept shores to the spice markets of India, the amber forests of Germany, and the olive groves of Africa. These networks were held together not just by the might of the legions, but by the quiet, relentless labor of sailors, merchants, and dockside workers. It was a world where risk and fortune danced in a constant motion. A merchant might lose everything in a single storm, or he might return from a voyage with enough wealth to buy an estate, an army of slaves, and a place in the Senate. The dock worker might toil his entire life moving amphorae, or he might, through wit, ambition, and a bit of luck, rise to control his own fleet. As long as the winds filled the sails, and as long as the harbor cranes groaned under their loads, as long as the warehouses of Ostia overflowed with goods bound for the capital, Rome endured. The heart of the empire was not its palaces or its battlefields. It was the sea, the ships, and the ceaseless movement of trade. Beneath this marble splendor of Rome, behind the grand spectacles of the Colosseum and the triumphal processions of emperors, lay the hidden machinery that sustained an empire of millions. It was an intricate system of bureaucracy, commerce, and brutal necessity built on the back of slaves, fueled by the grain fields of Egypt, and kept in motion by the ceaseless voyages of Rome's mighty grain fleet. Slavery was not just an institution in Rome, it was the framework upon which much of the empire rested. From the palatial halls of the imperial government to the teeming docks of Portus, from private estates to public works, slaves were omnipresent. Augustus, the first emperor, had built his civil service almost entirely out of slaves and freed men, as administrative work was deemed beneath the dignity of free Roman citizens. These educated slaves handled everything from tax collection to document drafting, ensuring the smooth operation of the state. For those fortunate enough to gain their freedom, opportunities abounded. Freedmen could enter business, amass fortunes, and even buy their own slaves to continue the cycle. In a bid to encourage economic growth, Emperor Claudius granted full citizenship to freedmen who invested in merchant ships, while Nero extended this same incentive to those who funded shipbuilding, ensuring that Rome's maritime dominance continued unabated. Not all of Rome's imports were for practical use. Alongside shipments of grain and luxury goods came a darker cargo, animals destined for slaughter in the blood-soaked sands of the amphitheater. Lions, leopards, and panthers, torn from the wilds of Africa and Asia Minor, were crammed into ships for the long journey to Rome. Many perished before reaching their destination, their lifeless bodies tossed overboard as a mere loss of cargo. Those that survived were herded into vast menageries, waiting their fate in the arena of the empire. A few were tamed, taught tricks to amuse crowd, but most were set loose, starving and maddened to rip apart human victims for the pleasure of the Roman masses. At first, these brutal contests were reserved for the deserting soldiers and criminals guilty of heinous crimes. But as the spectacles grew in scale, so too did the list of those condemned. Runaway slaves, rebels, and Christians who refused to worship the emperor found themselves thrown into the beasts. In a grotesque display of piety, statues of the gods adorning the amphitheater were veiled during such executions, as if to shield divine eyes from the carnage unfolding below. Juvenal, Rome's scathing satirist, famously declared that the people cared for nothing but bread and circuses. Whether an exaggeration or not, Rome's rulers understood the necessity of keeping the masses fed and entertained. By the 1st century A.D., the grain dole had become a cornerstone of imperial policy. What had begun as a vote-buying tactic by ambitious politicians had transformed into an essential state function. For 3 centuries, the 200,000 poorest residents of Rome, out of a population nearing 1 million, received either free or subsidized grain, later supplemented with wine and pork. The immense welfare system relied on the agricultural output of Sicily, North Africa, and above all, Egypt. Grain was not merely a project, it was a form of tribute. Egyptian farmers were taxed in wheat, their harvests stored in vast granaries in Alexandria before being shipped to Rome. After his conquest of Egypt, Augustus ensured that control of this vital resource remained in his hands alone. Posing as the divine successor to the Ptolemies, he installed a governor loyal only to him and barred senators from entering Alexandria without his permission, under the pretense of protecting their morals from the city's notorious indulgences. In reality, he sought to maintain an unbreakable grip on the empire's food supply. The grain ships of Alexandria were the pride of the Mediterranean, the very foundation upon which Rome's survival depended. Their protection was of paramount concern to the emperors. Augustus imposed strict laws punishing anyone who obstructed grain shipments. Claudius, upon discovering that Rome had only 15 days' grain supply left, offered financial incentives for captains willing to risk the treacherous winter seas to deliver their cargo. Most merchant ships wisely avoided the stormy months between November and March. By the reign of Trajan, 98 to 117 AD, the fleet had grown to include 85 massive vessels transporting an astonishing 150,000 tons of grain annually from Egypt to Rome. These ships followed a practiced schedule. Departing Italy in April, they harnessed the powerful trade winds reaching Alexandria in as little as 2 or 3 weeks. The return journey, however, was arduous. Laden with grain, the ships struggled against headwinds, zigzagging through the Aegean or hugging the Libyan coast before finally crossing to Sicily. The voyage back could take up to 2 months. The arrival of the fleet was a spectacle in itself. Roman author Lucius Seneca, writing from the port of Pozzuoli, described the thrill of seeing the distinctive Alexandrian ships whose topsails were uniquely permitted to remain raised even in harbor. He wrote, "Today the ships from Alexandria suddenly came into view. It is a welcome sight to the country. The whole mob at Pozzuoli stands on the docks. They can recognize the ships from Alexandria, even in a crowd of vessels, by their sails." The scale of these grain ships was simply astonishing. One, caught in a storm and blown off course, drifted to the port of Piraeus, where its sheer size left onlookers in awe. A bystander, seeing it for the first time, could scarcely believe his eyes and exclaimed, "What a size the ship was! 180 feet in length. The ship's carpenter told me the beam more than a quarter of that, and 44 feet from the deck to the lowest point in the hold. And the height of the mast! And what a yard it carried! And what a forestay they had to hold it up! and the way the stern rose up in gradual curve, ending in a gilded goosehead, matched at the other end by a forward, more flattened sweep of the prow with its figure of Isis, the goddess the ship was named after, on each side. Everything was incredible. The rest of the decoration, the paintings, the red topsail, even more, the anchors with their capstans and witches, and the cabins aft. The crew was like an army. They told me she carried enough grain to feed every mouth in Athens for a year. And it all depends for its safety on one little old man who turns these great steering oars with a tiller that's no more than a stick. They pointed him out to me, a woolly-haired little fellow, half-bald. Heron, I think his name was. This was the true face of Rome, not just its legions, its emperors, or its temples, but its ceaseless machinery of trade and labor. Slaves filled the administrative offices, kept the cities running, and loaded the ships. Merchants risked fortunes on the unpredictable seas. The imperial authorities governed access to Egypt's vast wheat fields with ruthless precision. And every year the grain fleet set sail once more, carrying not just the food, but the promise that Rome would endure. As Rome's wealth and power expanded, so too did its citizens' desire to see the world beyond their own borders. No longer content to remain within the city's crowded streets, Romans of means, whether merchants, scholars, officials, or idle aristocrats, set out to explore the wonders of the Mediterranean. The same massive ships that carried grain to Rome also served as passenger vessels, transporting hundreds of travelers at a time. Most were businessmen conducting affairs in distant ports, but many were tourists eager to witness the marvels of antiquity firsthand. Among all the destinations within Rome's reach, none surpassed Egypt in popularity. The gleaming metropolis of Alexandria, with its towering Pharos lighthouse and the vast library, captivated visitors from the north. From there, travelers boarded boats to sail down the Nile, marveling at the pyramids and temple ruins that predated their own civilization by thousands of years. One of the greatest curiosities was the ruined colossus of Amenophis III, which, under certain conditions, emitted a strange musical sound. A phenomenon that inspired awe and left its mark in the form of Latin graffiti scratched into the stone by Roman tourists. Greece was another favorite of Roman travelers who regarded it as the very cradle of civilization. Educated Romans embarked on grand tours of Athens, Olympia, and Delphi, eager to walk the footsteps of Homer and Plato. The Aegean Islands, Chios, Lesbos, and Samos were also frequent stops, while the once mighty Colossus of Rhodes, toppled by an earthquake centuries before, continued to draw visitors who marveled at its immense fallen remains. Even the shores of North Africa held unexpected attractions. In the seaside town of Hippozyritis, Romans flocked to see the tame dolphin that delighted children by playing in the surf. But the financial burden of hosting endless waves of tourists proved too much for the town's leaders, and in a desperate move, they killed the dolphin to stem the flood of visitors. Despite the Romans' enthusiasm for travel, their infrastructure lacked the conveniences of modern tourism. No regular passenger lines operated out of Portus or Ostia. Instead, travelers simply booked passage on whatever merchant vessel happened to be heading in that direction. Space was limited. Most of the hold was reserved for cargo, so passengers often had to settle for a place on deck. To shield themselves from the element, they carried collapsible shelters and brought along slaves to tend to their needs. Despite these inconveniences, sea travel was often preferable to overland routes, which were long, exhausting, and uncomfortable. Roman roads, though marvels of engineering, were brutal to traverse. Walking exposed one to dust and highway robbers, while riding in a carriage meant enduring bone-jarring jolts over stone-paved surfaces. The wealthy could recline in a litter borne by slaves, but even this was a slow and conspicuous form of travel. Compared to these options, a few weeks on a ship, even on a cramped deck, seemed a reasonable choice. But the sea also carried its own dangers. Thanks to the suppression of piracy, the Roman Mediterranean was generally safer than it had been in previous centuries. But the perils of the sea could never fully be tamed. In 61 AD, a ship carrying 600 passengers sank in the Adriatic. Only 80 survived, swimming desperately through the night until a passing vessel rescued them at dawn. The poet Terence, famed for his adaptations of Greek comedy, is believed to have perished at sea in 159 BC, while returning from Greece. Some accounts claim that he drowned, while others tell a more tragic story, that he died of grief after losing his baggage, which contained irreplaceable translations of 108 plays by Menander. For Romans, the Mediterranean was both a highway and a hazard, a route to fortune, knowledge, and adventure, but also a treacherous mistress who claimed her share of victims. Whether bound for trade, tourism, or fate itself, all who set sail did so with the knowledge that they were at the mercy of the sea. For those who reached their destination, wonders awaited. For those who did not, their fate was left to the depths.